G'day everyone, Kate here, part of the team at Narrate. In this message, Adam visits the art of asking questions and unpacks the value of their intentionality. Asking questions can change our posture towards relationships and enrich them for the better.
We're going to wrap up this series before we jump into a kind of a relationship, marriage, singleness series next week. This morning I want to wrap up this series. And there's a lot of things as it relates to the way we form words and the things that we say and the things we wish we didn't say and the things we should say. There's a lot of things that we haven't said so far, and I'm aware of that. But there's one idea that's left for me, and to be honest with you, it's the idea that created this series. I mean, it was like, okay, I really need to talk about this. I've really been thinking about this, really been wrestling with this. And there's this thing that I'm just convinced is a lost art. And as I sit across the table at coffee shops and as I listen to marriages and I listen to parents and I do the things that my job gives me the privilege to do, it's just time and time and time again, it's reaffirmed to me that this skill is in some ways very, very simple, and yet the lack of it changes the dynamics of relationships for the worse to a very large degree. I'm convinced that knowing how to do this or not knowing how to do this is reflected in your relationships a lot. I'm convinced that if you were to dissect the marriages that you respect and that you admire, you would see that both entities, or at least one of them, has this trait. I'm convinced that those bosses that you like working for, those leaders that you trust, those organizations that you enjoy, that it's at the center of the fabric of their being. I think it's absolutely essential if we're going to be heard in our community, if we're going to be the types of people that people who otherwise disrespect us or disagree with us still respect us. I just think it's huge. And what excites me about talking about it is that I'm also well aware of the fact that it's a weakness for me. And I know I said that a couple weeks ago about the complaining stuff. Turns out I wasn't exaggerating. But it's also very true here. That what encourages me here is I bumped into this idea years ago. Some people introduced me to it. This came from several different angles, studying a whole bunch of Jewish culture at one point, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. That all kind of converged on me. And I've had to learn to do it. And I think for those of you that are here struggling through marriage, struggling with your kids, trying to figure out workplace stuff, all the different things that factor in, I just think it's so simple that you're going to be really annoyed and you're going to wish that I had to stop talking 10 minutes before I do because you're like, okay, I got it. But it's huge. And then, I don't know if you're one of those people that kind of scratches your head and don't understand us and what we're about, or maybe you're new to this place and you're still trying to figure us out, or maybe you kind of like us and kind of don't, but you don't exactly know why. I think that what we're going to talk about this morning is at the core of what makes us us, and I think that because it's been an intentional effort on our part, on my part. From the very beginning, we've said, let's approach God this way, let's approach others this way, let's talk about marriage this way, let's talk about ideas this way. Let's just make this a central posture that we live with. And so hopefully this morning you'll gain an understanding, or maybe even a vocabulary as you try to understand this place, or if you own this place already, how to kind of, oh yeah, okay, thank you. That clarifies some things. And if you're someone that is really suspicious of us, I think we're going to touch on why that might be the case. In fact, I would dare say that the people who blog and whatever it is, people that don't like people, because it's really easy to not like people, and then we have the internet, so it's like we can like people and make a living doing it. I think that the criticism we get, it comes from this posture. I think the reason why sometimes people are suspicious of us and would even say, that's not a church, they don't teach the Bible. I think where that's born out of is this posture, because here's the deal. I'll just kind of tip my hand, and I try not to, this would be ironic, but I'm absolutely convinced that God wants us to relate to him in this way. Just absolutely convinced. And yet I think rarely are we given the opportunity to relate to him in this way. I had a phone call this week. It was really a privilege to have it as this guy who's in the Midwest and interning at a church and from here and has been invited to come back here and work for a church here. And he was doing some research on Helena. It's been 6 years since he lived here. And it was a privilege, right? I mean, someone's calling me going, hey, so tell me about this place. But he started the conversation this way. He said, Adam, what you need to know, this is after we kind of got through the small talk, what you need to know is I'm hearing a lot of really bad things from a lot of people about you guys. Oh, thank you. It's a great way to start a conversation. And then he said, but I think I decided that I wanted to give you a chance to speak to it first. And I went, oh, great. And we had a great conversation. But I think if you don't like us, or if you can't figure out why people don't like us, I think this is why. Because this morning what I want to talk about is the role, the place, the value of questions. Like what role do they play in your life? How many of them do you ask? Because it seems to me that we often think that the key to unlocking a good relationship, the key to getting our kids to obey us, the key to having a spouse that cooperates with our visions for their life, like the key is telling things. I guess I want to get you thinking this morning about what's your ratio of questions to statements? And maybe we could just start here. How many questions have you asked today? Like you woke up and some of you, I know, you grabbed your cup of coffee and you grabbed your Bible and you tried to connect with the Lord. And how many questions did you ask him? Or even as you got up and you bumped into your spouse or your kids or your roommates, how many questions did you ask? What did you ask them about as you were driving here to this place? See, here's the deal. If you're with somebody all the time and for some reason, whenever you're with them, you still feel very, very lonely, I'll bet you if you analyze it, they never ask you any questions. If there's someone you spend a ton of time with and you just don't feel valued by them, I'll bet you they talk a lot and ask very, very little. Because you drove here and you looked at creation and this incredibly gorgeous community that we live in. Like what questions did that provoke in you? As you listened to ideas on the radio or as you saw people that you look forward to seeing and you only get to see them once a month, like what did that provoke in you to wonder about? This morning, I guess ultimately I just want to provoke you to think about how intentional am I as a question asker? I think presence, like not Christmas presents, like with somebody, I think the greatest reflection of presence is your ability to recall events from their life this last week and to ask them about them. And I wonder if that wouldn't change some of the dynamics of our relationships. I was reading this book years ago about a guy who was a student at MIT, which is one of those, like I can't even pronounce what it stands for, really, really prestigious school. And he had a wife and a 5-year-old daughter, and he was a grad student, I believe, at MIT. And it was one of those weeks where he had a really difficult test coming up. And so he'd said to his wife, like, hey, this week I just kind of need to disappear after dinner, and I just need to study. And so they agreed. And I think it was a Tuesday or maybe it was a Wednesday night. After dinner, he said to his wife, just kind of reaffirmed what he had established. And that was news to his daughter. So, hey, I'm going to go sit at the office. Can't bother me. Okay, great. And they all agreed. He walked into the office. He'd been there about an hour. And then he heard the Cookie Monster footsteps. All parents have been, oh, they're up. Oh, no, hide. And then he heard the doorknob. And I'm sure, I hope you've been there because that'll make me feel better about myself if you've been here too. But like he was ready to pounce by the time she emerged in the door, and he had it all prepared. He was locked and loaded. He was ready to let her have it. And he did. Something like you shouldn't be here, but lots of 4-letter words and things like that probably. And he's just mad. Let her have it. It was like a flash bomb had gone off for her, and she just stood there. And she teared up, and she turned and ran out of the room. And he followed, closed the door, felt very justified in his anger, sat back down, studied. Next morning, he was still ticked at the world, was still griping to his wife about what had happened. And finally, she interrupted him, and she said, his wife said, I sent her in there. And he's mad at her. And she said, I sent her in there to say goodnight and that she loves you, and to ask if you wanted me to bring you a cup of coffee before I went to bed. And I think in that moment we begin to capture the danger of telling things versus asking things. Because what we see there is a moment where he could have had all of the same results, the same disciplines, the same observations, but you could ask this question, what would it have taken for him to have asked a question there instead of make a statement? It would require that he assume that she had information that he didn't. That he didn't have all the information. And you begin to see there's something about the posture of the person who's willing to ask the questions. Tony Robbins has made this statement, and it's stuck in my head for years. He says the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your questions. What if that's true? What if it's true as a husband, as a wife, as a parent, as a leader, as whatever field you're in? What if it's true as a Christ follower? And you know what gets really fascinating as you start kind of peeling back the layers on this is that this is kind of a foreign concept for us in our culture, but it's unique to our culture. That in other times, in other places, in other parts of the world, questions were incredibly valuable to people. in the Eastern world that certainly Judaism was born into and many other spiritual kind of realms, like questions were how you demonstrated knowledge. In fact, we know now from the days around Jesus' life, and this is where this kind of all started unfolding for me, and it's like, wow, this is fascinating. In Jesus' day, the way you became qualified to hang out with the best of the best of the best rabbis, the way you qualified to talk life and theology with the most gifted theologians on the planet, wasn't by telling them what you knew. It was by telling them what questions you had. Literally, the practice was a rabbi would go about his life, he would do his thing, he would serve the people he was serving, and his talmidim, his disciples, these students who had graduated into that last layer where either they were going to go learn the family trade or they were going to be among the elite who got to continue in some kind of theological training, their job was to convince the rabbi, to impress the rabbi with their questions. And they would follow him around from town to town and day to day, and they would ask all these questions. Because you see, the Jews, they understood that the more you wrestle with God, the more questions that raises. Not that there weren't things that they didn't affirm and believe and hold tightly to. But listen, isn't this true of your field? Whether you build houses or work on teeth or you work in business in some other fashion, whether you teach students or you are a student, isn't it true that the people, the more you know, the more you become an expert? Don't you just have this general sense like that should make you more humble? More like, I don't know, I've got questions. Abraham Joshua Heschel is this rather well-known Jewish rabbi. He lived in the New York area, lived and died in the 20th century. He created quite a stir, I suppose it's been 20 years ago now, where he said, you Americans have your education system backwards. He said, you think that the way you gauge a student's knowledge of a subject is by giving them the questions and telling them to give you the answers, but if your intent is really to gauge someone's proficiency in a topic, you should give them the answers and tell them to give you the questions. Because that, he said, is what demonstrates expertise. It's knowing what you don't know, right? When I talk to my doctor friends, they're very, very quick to refer people. Why? Because they're experts in an area, and they know when they hit the edge of their expertise, there's lots they don't know, and they're humble about that. Abraham Joshua Heschel was one time asked if you were Solomon and you were given the same deal that Solomon was given, which remember someone asked Solomon, hey, if you could have anything, or God said to Solomon, like, I'll give you anything, what do you want? And Solomon said what? He said, wisdom. Abraham Joshua Heschel, kind of with this, like, with all due respect to Solomon, because he was the wisest man on the earth, he said, I'll take wonder. Give me wonder. He said, after living my life before God and with people and in relationship, I'm just convinced that it's curiosity that drives health. And it even goes beyond the Jewish culture. When you look at history, what you begin to see, and this observation was made for me, I didn't make this, but when you begin to study history and the history of revolutions, say the French Revolution or even something like suffrage or race in the United States, what you see is that we often think that revolutions are created by people with really big ideas who have really persuasive personalities, who find a microphone and a stage and a soapbox of some sort, and they begin to use lots of exclamation points and they make their ideas known, and the crowd kind of hits fever pitch and they raise their swords and they're willing to sacrifice much, and there's this mob thing that happens. Historically, that's not what starts a revolution. What historians tell us is what starts a revolution is the right question. Not any question, because good questions aren't easy. But it's when the right question is asked. Gandhi started asking the right question. Joseph Stalin, if you want to get negative, he started asking the right question. Martin Luther King Jr., long before he had a dream, he had questions. And that's what begins to tip the scales in the direction of change. You know this. You know this from your own desires and issues with change in your life. That it's when someone asks you a poignant question, that's when suddenly things start to move for you. This played itself out in Athens about 2,400 years ago. There was a revolutionary that you'll recognize his name when I give it to him. And what's interesting about this revolutionary was all he did was ask questions. He was in Athens in a time when what happened when you proved to be intelligent or gifted was you climbed the political ladder. You gained power through politics, through the civic world, and if not, you aspired to be this well-published philosopher. And yet this man did none of those things. He wasn't beautiful. They describe him as short and pudgy and homely, one historian called him. He wore a toga all the time. And yet this guy is one of the most impactful revolutionaries ever because of his questions. He never had political office. He didn't ever obtain any type of power through the civic world. He didn't publish a single book. He didn't teach at a school or start a school. He didn't even offer a formal class. All Socrates did was ask questions. And his questions made him famous because his questions quickly proved threatening, because the people of Athens, they understood that he was calling their whole order. He was calling it out. See, they were a culture that had relied heavily upon slave labor, and he started to ask questions about that. No speeches, nothing of the sort, just questions. He particularly liked to ask questions to the younger generation. Just posing questions. And though the Athenians had become really, really numb to the danger of the situation that they'd allowed to occur, they weren't naive. And they began to recognize that Socrates was a greater threat to the security of Athens than were any of the major city-states like Sparta. And eventually he was arrested. Not for anything he had said, but for questions he had asked. And this jury reluctantly put him on trial and found him guilty, which history tells us is ironic because he was incredibly pious and he was a patriot. And yet they found him guilty because he was trying to undermine the government, they said. They were particularly angry about his work with youth and the things that he was doing to undermine religion. He was sentenced to exile, but refused. They gave him an alternative. The capital punishment, the death penalty via self-inflicted suicide. He agreed. And he died, not for what he said, but for what he asked. See, history tells us that revolutions, they start when someone asks the right question. Now, I don't know what you do with Jesus. I don't know what your beliefs are about him. But I do know that most of us, I would like to think, and I think that an honest student of history would have to at least acknowledge that whatever you do with his divinity, whether or not you believe he's God or not, no single person has had a larger impact upon civilization than did Jesus. And yet stop and think about this. How did he do it? He asked a lot of questions. He asked a ton of questions. In fact, I spent some time this last fall. And I was kind of working on this in my own life because I was just motivated by the fact that I'm telling all the time and asking almost never. So I counted. I went through and counted. I've got an Excel spreadsheet. It's nerdy. I'll share it with you. 291. That's how many questions that I count that Jesus asked. 291 questions. Now, at the risk of being patronizing, the Gospels where you would find the things Jesus said and taught, these aren't biographies, but they're certainly the only collection we have of his teachings from that, that's the Gospels. 291 questions. In Mark, the second Gospel, the shortest Gospel of the four, in Mark, 42% of the time when Jesus enters into an interaction with somebody, his first response is a question. So Jesus interacts with somebody, they say something to him, almost half the time he asks a question. I think it's in John, it's about a third of the time. And then there's this thing where he does where someone asks him a question, and what's he do? He asks him a question, and you kind of get like, would you just answer the question? Why won't he? Maybe there's things that we could learn there. Just look at some of the... here's one way to think about this. One guy, I think, summarized it perfectly. He said, the man who claimed to be the answer asked a lot of questions. See, if you struggle with God, if you're like my friend who... It's been since 1968, and that was why he was up there, was he was pointing out, like, that was my culture. It was tell, believe, adopt. If you struggle with God, it might have everything to do with the lack of safety that comes with the permission to ask a question. Just listen to some of his questions, because I think you begin to see the brilliance of them. Like at one point, he's talking about anxiety and worry, and look at what he says. Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? So you're talking to your friend on the phone, and they're worrying. What's more effective? To say, stop worrying? Or to say, well, let me ask you this. Can you change the situation by worrying about it? Like, which one's more effective? I was talking with a therapist on Friday, and, yep, therapist, I need therapy. was actually having a meeting with her to see if I could refer all of you guys to her group. So if the truth would be known. So just so you know, I got you hooked up when you decide that you're ill. So I said, what's the difference between counseling and therapy? She said, counseling by design is about telling people what to do. There's a place for that. Therapy, she said, is about helping them discover for themselves what to do. I'm going to argue Jesus was a therapist. There's this other one. He says to this guy who is waiting by a pool to hope that it would get stirred by an angel, do you want to get well? Now, let's just kind of set the stage there. And I know we've done this before, but the stage is there's all these people, and this is like the corner at Walmart, and these are all the people with the cardboard sign. It's people who have physical or mental issues, and in this culture, there wasn't government assistance of any kind. Like, this was how they survived. And there was a pool within the walls of Jerusalem, and the belief was that periodically the angels came and did something magical, something supernatural to the water, and the first person into the water was healed. But what we know historically was that the reality was this became a place of belonging. That the reason they went there was the same reason we all go to places we're familiar with. This was their people. And furthermore, this was how they made their living. And so as foreign as it is for us to think about, they didn't want to be healed because they didn't know how they were going to eat tomorrow if they did get healed. But they did know how they were going to eat tomorrow if they could still hold out the sign. And so Jesus walks into this room, hundreds of people. And it's always seemed so insincere because he walks, excuse me, pardon me. Oh, sorry, stepped on that. Well, you're numb anyway. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's like this kind of like walks through this mob of people. And he says to one guy, hey, do you want to get well? Now, if you've ever counseled somebody in their marriage, if you've ever offered advice for anything, you understand the brilliance of the question. Because he was cutting right to it. Listen. Do you want to be well? How much better is that than him walking up and giving some advice? Or there's another one where a woman who was caught in adultery, and many of you, I'm sure, know the story. She's caught in adultery, and the reality is so was the man, but they don't bring the man, and they bring her to Jesus, and they're ready to kill her, and they're trying to trap Jesus. And listen to what Jesus says to her. Hey, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? What's the difference between that and making a statement? Or there's this other one that I think is funny, if not a little disrespectful the way I'm presenting it, because it reminds me that we're all parents and we're all going to be overbearing and we all have in-laws and all those things. But Jesus is at a wedding. They run out of wine. He hasn't even proven that he hasn't demonstrated himself to be God yet. His mom comes up to him. It's like 2 a.m, like, hey, they're out of wine. We need more wine. And Jesus looks at her and goes, woman, why do you involve me? See, dudes, you have all kinds of permission. Like, why are you always in my house? It's brilliant, isn't it? It's a little less confrontational, I think. If you were to go to Hastings and you were to start pulling books off the shelf about Jesus, you would find lots of them that argue that Jesus never claimed to be God. That's one of the great troubling things for 2,000 years about people reconciling Jesus. Some would say he never forthrightly claimed. And what they mean was he wasn't like us. He wasn't a Western thinker. He didn't offer this outline, didactic, point. Here's who I am. In fact, and don't get me wrong, I believe he's God. And I believe he thought he was God. But this is about as close as he gets to saying that he was. Hey, who do people say that I am? Now, listen, you have friends who don't follow Jesus. What's more helpful? A tract underneath their windshield wiper? Or good questions? I was talking to a gal this week, and she was saying that she was dating this guy, getting ready to marry this guy, and she wasn't a Christ follower, and this guy drug her into his pastor, and the idea was like the guy wanted his pastor to save the gal so that he could marry the gal. And she's a Christ follower today. And she said, you know why I'm a Christ follower? Yeah, why? She said, because the pastor looked at him and said, what are you doing? This is God's work, not your work. Leave her alone. Do you see the posture difference? Do you see the dynamic that happens when you ask somebody something versus tell them something? And if you ask the question, what's the value here? Why should we do this? Here's the place for me personally where this all lands is ultimately it comes down to the commission that we have to love people by taking an interest in them. And if you ask me, okay, Adam, point me to the verse that says I need to become a better question asker, I'm taking you to Philippians 2. Because listen to what Paul says. I can't quite figure out how you would live what Paul's saying here out without really poignant, intentional questions. So Paul's going to start, and what he's explaining here is, okay, if you believe in Jesus, you're following Jesus, you want to know how to be like Jesus, you want to interact with people like that, like, okay, here we go. So therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, in other words, like if you're at this place where you're like, Lord, I'm in, how do I help? Then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one in mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. And here's the part that this might even be worth memorizing for you. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. What does a question do when you're having coffee or lunch or something like that with somebody else? Suddenly, when they ask you a question, you're more important, they're more important. When you ask them a question, aren't you demonstrating that you're valuing them more than yourself? Like, just rather in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Ever had coffee with somebody or lunch or, I don't know. I mean, those are the things I do. I'm pretty boring. Lunch, coffee, home, lunch, coffee, home. It's really exciting. Actually, it is. You ever sat with someone for 2 hours and realized you didn't talk? Did that make you feel loved, valued? Okay, so here's the deal. I don't think you would be here if there wasn't desire for change. I don't think anything we do is good enough that it would just bring people if you were just here for the entertainment. Like NBC's got a way bigger budget than we do. Like I'm not so naive as to think that we can compete with any of that. I think you're here because you desire change. Whether that's positive change in terms of like you feel like you're doing well, but you're a learner and you want to continue to grow, or you're in a marriage and it's desperate, or as a parent you're lost, whatever it is. I think my friend that I referenced here this morning, he didn't just come because he heard the coffee was good. I think he came because there's something in him that he wants to work on. A revolution, at the risk of using dramatic language. Let me ask you this. What would becoming a better question asker do for your marriage? Think about what made dating fun. Isn't what makes dating fun, it's the mystery. And hopefully the mystery stays more cerebral than it does physical. That's its own conversation. But like it's the mystery of it all, right? Like it's the, like I want to know you. I want to understand you. And the reason you go to coffee, and do you remember when you were dating and you'd look at the old couple across the room and you'd go like, we're never going to be that couple who's just standing here and have nothing to say. And now you're that couple, right? Because dating, there's just this perpetual curiosity. Now, is it going to take more work for you to be curious of your spouse 10 years, 20 years, 50 years later? Uh-huh. Is it what drives a good relationship? I think so. See, here's one of the tricks. Its questions sound easy. But you know as well as I do, it is way harder to show up after work with a really personal, intentional question for your spouse than it is to just show up and share for 45 minutes about your day. That's questions are work. I have a friend, he is the master at this, like makes me self-conscious master of this. He has, I don't know, like beautiful mind. I kind of wonder if I ever saw the bedroom, if he'd had Post-it notes everywhere, because he does this thing where, and sometimes he'll take notes when you're with him and sometimes not, but he's the king of circling back to anything you might have said earlier. So like you'll watch him take notes, like you're talking about, hey, I'm going to take this test this week, or hey, I'm doing this interview this week, or hey, I'm going here this week, or I'm reading this, or this thing's scaring me, or my wife did this. Whatever it is you bring up, almost without fail, weeks or months later, he's going to go, hey, so how's that book? Or hey, are you still working on that? You know what I've had to figure out? That's not just he's a freak of nature. It's a discipline. He has Post-it notes. He has notes in his phone. He writes down, next time I'm talking to this person, here's what I can ask them. I was having a conversation with him earlier. It was hilarious. And he was sharing a phone call that he'd had, and this person had talked for a long time. And he said, in passing, he said, yeah, so while he was talking, I wrote down 8 questions I'm going to ask him next time I talk to him. Who does that? How loved do you suppose the people in his life feel? What if as a parent, you worked that hard on your questions? And I know we're all once bit, twice shy. I ask the same stupid question and get the same stupid answer to my kids every day. What'd you do today? Same thing we do every day. Duh. That's the point. It takes work, doesn't it? You have to remember, what was concerning them earlier in the week? What things were they excited about? What can I ask them? Let's take you and God. I think you're in the room because at some point you had a crisis. Maybe you're in the middle of it now. Maybe you had it in the past. But we know from sociology that what causes people to step into relationship with God is a crisis. That's one of the things. Whether it's crisis of the soul, crisis of the intellect, or like someone died. I mean, there's lots of different crises that can happen. What does a crisis create for you with regard to God? Mystery, doesn't it? We beat his chest and ask him why that had to happen. Why does God use language like, seek me? Does that sound like a God who says, like, here, I just want to give you all the points and you memorize them and we'll be good forever? No, seek, hide and seek. God wants to be, he wants you to be interested enough in him to want to know him more. I wonder if God seems like a cardboard cutout to you at this point in your relationship with him. Maybe you know too much. Maybe you're too theologically sound. Maybe you've been to too many Christian classes. Why do we not promote all these Christian small groups around here? Because I'm not convinced that information's the issue. Maybe your knowledge of God is, maybe God is going, hey, when you're wondering something about me again, that'll be so much fun. What? I had a friend years ago who I told him I was going to go to Bible study or Bible school, which I don't think I would have got in anyway. Well, I did get in, but I had to lie to get in, so that's a different story. But he said, you don't need to go to Bible school. I said, I want to go to Bible school. You don't need to go to Bible school. I want to go to Bible school. You don't have to. Okay, why don't I? Which, by the way, if you've been to Bible school, great, go to Bible school. I'm not trying to say don't go to Bible school. But he said, you don't have to. Why are you going to go? I said, I want to know how to study the Bible. He said, well, I can show you how to do that. Okay. So he pulled out his Bible and opened to John 1. John 1:1 is this really heady, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God in the beginning. And it's one of these like, well, I'm just spinning in circles. He said, here's your assignment. Before we meet next time, I want to see 100 questions. What do you mean? I just want you to read those 4 verses and write down 100 questions. What do you suppose that does to your interaction with Scripture? Suddenly God is this mystery again. I dare you. If you don't own a Bible, grab one from Guest Central as you leave. That's why that team is there. They'd love to give you a Bible. And you go to, say, Mark, and read one instance, one story of Jesus. And don't think about what are you supposed to know. Don't think about what are you supposed to believe. Don't think about what are you supposed to do. Ask questions. Wonder. See what that might do. If you're someone that's isolated, and I don't want to trivialize that because we know that the most important thing in life is that you feel connected. Could I just challenge you to consider that if you're always with people but always feel alone, that you have a wonder problem. You're what the clinical people would say are self-absorbed. You talk about yourself all the time, and it's exhausting. What if you chose to capture all of that energy and be genuinely curious in others? I had a staff member say to me this week, Adam, I wasn't looking for advice. I just wanted to share that. What is that? Stop being an idiot. Ask some questions and listen. Listen, if you're someone here and God for you is an enigma, or maybe worse, maybe you're angry, I think that often has everything to do with being told. Believe these 4 points, these 30 points. So I just want to kind of reaffirm that challenge. My challenge to you would be swing by, grab the Bible, and discover a God who says, please relate to me in the mystery. Not that there's not things to know, not that there aren't things to believe, but please step into the mystery of it all. I had a professor in college who used to say, mystery without study is worthless. And that kind of calls us out on being lazy, right? Like, oh, it's all a mystery. Oh, it's all a mystery. Well, yeah, it is a mystery, but you should figure out why. Mystery without study, he said, is worthless. Mystery after study is priceless. Why? Because maintaining your curiosity about God is incredibly difficult. What kind of revolution might you be able to bring to your relationships by knowing less and wondering more?
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.